Hello, I'm Richard, and today we're going to change the timing belt and water pump on this 1997 Mazda Miata. And so we'll show you a few little tricks and things that you really should do to make sure you do the job right the first time and don't have any problems and have a vehicle that's reliable over the long term. So let's get started. Well, of course, first thing you want to do is order your parts. Make sure you get the proper components for your particular vintage of vehicle. And once we've done that, we want to disconnect the battery. A lot of times people just get started and they omit doing that. And you can probably get away with not disconnecting the battery, but it only takes once for you to short something out and do some arc welding with a wedding ring or a screwdriver or a wrench, and you wish you had disconnected the battery. So we always do that first. So the battery, depending on which vintage vehicle you have, will either be on top like this one is on this 97, or it's down below the carpet like on the second generation. But they're all in the same place, the passenger rear corner. You'll notice that we have this up on ramps, and that allows us easy access underneath the vehicle for draining the coolant, which is what we're going to do next. And it also makes it easier to work on underneath the hood because we don't have to bend over so far. And so let's drain the coolant. The coolant is drained from underneath, and the access hole is in the bottom of the pan right here. You're protecting it, and you'll see a little Phillips head plug, and that's what we're going to remove. You also want to remove the fill, the radiator cap, and then remove this plug. And you can either reuse the coolant or put new coolant in. I use this opportunity to replace it and put new coolant in. So let's drain the coolant. Next, we're going to remove the intake. So this can stay in place. This is an aftermarket cold air intake, but it can stay in place. The original air box, it's best to remove it, get out of the way. But we're going to remove this, the hoses, and get it out of the way. There's only a few points to disconnect, and so with some pliers and a Phillips screwdriver, we're going to pull this out of the way. And before we get too far into this, I do want to mention something that I recommend, and that is that you take photographs. Take photographs from multiple angles, and that way, if you have any questions on how something goes back together, you have a reference. And there's been times where that's kind of saved me, because the book may not show exactly how it goes, and but having a good photograph, and you can't have too many. Take them from as many angles and so forth as you can, because you never know if you're going to need that going back together. Next, we want to remove the upper radiator hose. And this is a good time to inspect your hoses and stuff, hoses and belts, and replace anything that's, questionable. Now's the time to do that. You also want to remove the two hoses right here on your upper radiator hose thermostat housing here. So we'll get those out of the way. And then we're going to remove the belts. And we'll do the one on the power steering and air conditioning first. But before we do that, we're going to remove the fan on the driver's side. And there's just 2 bolts to be removed, and we can pull the fan out. To remove the belt off the power steering and air conditioning pump, we're going to loosen up that 12 millimeter bolt right there, and the 14 right here. Okay. And this is what you run into a lot of times. That thing is on there pretty good, so we're going to get a little bigger ratchet, put a little more leverage on it. Okay. Went to the 1/2-inch drive. Came loose, no problem. Where the 3/8 couldn't get it to break. So once we do that, then we're going to loosen this. This is your adjustment for tensioning the belt, and so to remove it we need to loosen that. And that too is a I believe a 12. Let's take a look. And yes, it is. It's a 12 millimeter. We're able to loosen that. And once we loosen that, we should be able to take tension off the belt here. Get this to move, and then be able to remove this belt. And you know, this is always easier said than done. And so we'll get that loose, and there's another bolt we need to get to, and that's why we remove the fan. So to get to that, we'll pull out that fan first, so we'll have easier access. And it's just a couple of 10 millimeter bolts, and that'll allow us to remove the fan. Okay, on the 2003 I recently did this on. It had only the 2 on the top to be removed. This has 2 bolts on the bottom to be removed also. So make sure you unplug the wiring connection and lift that out. This now will give us access to this bolt which comes out, which is too long to get out with the fan in place. So that's the reason for removing the fan. Now I'm going to rotate the engine clockwise. I have my ratchet on the crank bolt down there, and I'm going to rotate it until I can see the bolt through the hole right here. We'll give you a close-up of that. So this is a shot through the power steering pulley, giving us access to that bolt. And we're going to remove that. And we need to loosen it now in order to get the belt off. But we're going to remove the belt. We're also going to move the power steering pump out of the way. Okay, we did the same thing with the alternator belt. We loosened the bolt that it pivots on. We loosened the bolt that the adjusting bolt goes into. So this is the other point, the top one there. and there's the adjuster right there. So once those were loosened, then we loosened that adjusting bolt all the way out, pushed on the belt a little bit, loosened it up, pulled it out. So now we have access to the water pump and crank and so forth here. Now, one trick is to loosen these bolts on the water pump pulley prior to removing the belt, and I highly recommend that, and that makes these then easier to remove. We can just pull them out with our fingers now. The other thing is, make sure you label all your nuts and bolts, where they go, or put them back where they came from, as we did with the radiator, the bolts that held the fan to the radiator. Those things will save you some head scratching when things are going back together. So let's pull the pulley out of the way, and then we'll show you what we do on the crank. So after removing the pulley that goes on the water pump, and those are 10mm bolts, we then will remove the 10mm bolts that hold on the crankshaft pulley. There's 4 of those, and they're easy to get loose, and once you do that, we'll be able to remove the pulley, and we'll show you what that looks like once that's out of the way. But what's next is, like I said, we'll remove the pulley, and then what we want to do is disconnect the outlet from the water pump, and I'll show you that also. Okay, this is the crankshaft pulley. On this particular one, there's a little spacer ring that goes like so. Make note of which hole the pin comes out of. There's a pin on the crank, so we want to make sure that we put this back correctly. There's only one way that it would bolt in, but take note of it. Then behind this is this ring, and again, take note of how it goes in, which goes in and what goes out. Marked it with out here so that I can easily see it going back in. And so let's take a close-up of what it looks like now that we've removed those items. Let's see if we can put a little more light on the subject here. So there's the crank with the pulley removed. We're seeing the air conditioning compressor down here. We move the power steering pump up out of the way, zip tight it so it stays out of the way, because we're going to want to unconnect, remove the bolts here for the water pump. And we'll take a look at that in a moment. But next, we're going to pull off the stuff on the valve cover. So we're going to remove things like the crankcase vent tube right there. We need to remove our plug wires and plugs, so forth. So that's what we're going to do next. Let's remove any hoses that are connected. And like I said, depending on the vintage of vehicle that you have, there will be different things to remove. On the 03 that we just recently did, had the variable valve timing, and so there was that plumbing to disconnect for that. banjo fitting in the back, and so forth. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the plug wires. I'm going to mark them so that we make sure we put them back in the correct spot. Okay, so we removed the plug wires, and we removed 2 bolts that hold the coil pack to the valve cover, and we just disconnected this to get it kind of out of the way. And next we're going to remove the plugs. Remove the vacuum line there. So there's nothing else attached to our valve cover. So it'll be free to remove once we pull the spark plugs. When removing the spark plugs, make sure that you keep the your extension nice and straight, so you're not putting any lateral force on those plugs. And it'll loosen up, and once it gets loose enough, you can turn it by hand, and you can just unthread it by hand. Pull it out. You can inspect the plugs, make sure they're burning good. This one looks just fine. And this is a good time to replace the plugs also. So after we remove the rest of the plugs, we're going to remove the valve cover. And that's with these 10mm bolts around and then down the center. We'll remove those and then we'll lift off the valve cover. Well, now we're going to lift off the valve cover, and sometimes you need to give it a little bit of a tap with a rubber mallet. Don't tap it too hard, but just to break that seal so that we can lift it off. And we're sticking it on something back here. There we go. And there's our first look inside. So now is where things will start getting interesting in a moment. One of the things I like to do is a good visual. Look and see what kind of wear there is on the cam lobes, and make sure everything looks like it's being well lubricated. We look good. The belt part that I can see looks good. But what we're going to do next is remove the timing belt cover. And there's 3 pieces to that, at least on the second gen. And there's 2 lengths of bolts. There's longer ones, and then the 3 bottom ones down here are shorter. So 2 across one another down at the very bottom, and 1 on the left hand side right here, kind of across from the water pump. They're shorter, they're all 10mm, and then these upper ones are a little bit longer. So we'll remove those next and remove the cover. So here's our first look with the timing belt cover removed. There's our crankshaft pulley, or not necessarily the pulley, but crankshaft drive with the belt on it, and our retaining ring. And that bolt, 21 millimeter bolt, is what we're going to remove next. And that's torqued down there pretty good. And so we're going to loosen it but not remove it at this point. There's the that's your idler right there, your exhaust cam, your intake, and this is the tensioner pulley on this side. You can see the spring. We'll discuss tensioning and so forth in a bit on installation. But like I said, next we want to remove that bolt. So we're going to use a 21 millimeter socket and a breaker bar, and we need a way to hold the crankshaft still. And you know, you can make something, because I do these not just on my own that I own. I have more than one Miata myself, but I do it for others. It pays to have the right tool. And even if you only do it once, the tool's probably worth the money. Here's what I use. This is a tool by Flying Miata. I don't know, it's like $20, or yeah, $20, $19.95 or something. Fits all years, and well, I shouldn't say all years. It fits from 90 to 2005. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put that on the crank, and we will use the pulley bolts. We'll go in 2 of those holes, and that will then be our the piece that we use to hold that crank still while we loosen up that bolt using our breaker bar. So, like I said, you can make your own. Real simple to measure and notch a piece of steel. So you can see how it is. It's real simple, but like I said, it's not a big expense either. And you can order that at the same time you order your replacement belt and pump and so forth. Anyway, just a suggestion. Well, let me tell you, having the right tool can save you a lot of pain and suffering. And so with that tool in place, it's actually up against this bracket, and then it allows us to break that free. I already broke it free as it takes a little bit of a oomph, but I've done it without the tool, and let me tell you, the tool's well worth the 20 bucks. So now, once we have that loose, we're going to set the valve timing to the point where we're going to lock everything in place and remove the belt. So we'll show you that. Okay, what we're doing next is we want to set the valve timing at top dead center on the number 1. This is our number 1 cylinder. And what we're going to do is we're going to rotate the crankshaft just using a ratchet down here, and it looks like we're at that point, and that is where on the compression stroke, top dead center, number 1. And we'll go around just to show you what that is. What's happening now is this is the compression stroke, and now it's going to the exhaust stroke. This is the exhaust cam on this side, and so we're going up on the lobes, opened our exhaust valves. We're now exhausting, exhaust stroke on number 1. We now have the intake valves opening, and so we're on the intake stroke. We're coming off, the valves are closing, and we are now beginning the compression stroke. And that's where we want to be. So once we see that we're getting close to that, we're going to watch our timing mark down here on the crank. And so we'll move the camera in and get a view of that. So you can see where our marks are. We're coming up this way, coming that way on that one, and I'll show you once we get there. This is also moving over towards our reference point over here. Same with that one. But what we're going to watch though is the crank. And let me zoom in on the crank for you. So this is the timing mark that we want to watch. Try not to shadow things here. So we're turning over. Okay, you see it coming now. That little notch that's our top dead center mark on the crank, and we're going to match it up with this one on the case. So once again, let me show that to you. That's the mark on the crank. That's the mark on the case. We're going to line those two up. Nice and slow. There you have it. At that point, we want to look and see where our other marks are. Notice on the intake, right there. That's the last one we're making contact with. Same way on the exhaust side here. Last one we're making contact is where the mark is. Now, what I like to do is count the number of notches between there, as well as the number of notches once we leave the bottom side here and go down to the crank. That way I know it's where it needs to be. But let me show you another little tool that we use that makes this a much easier process. Again, I believe it's $14.95 from Flying Miata. There's others that you can get. I'm not a paid spokesperson for Flying Miata, but I just happen to have their tools and they work well. So there it is. It meshes with the teeth. It has little holes in it so that we can use the wire tie, go through that, through the holes and around the gear. Make sure it doesn't, fall and come out of place. We'll see the value of this putting it back together. But anyway, so I'm going to wire tie that into place, and then from there we're going to count our little teeth. If I can get my laser to show up on the belt here. Anyway, we'll count these little bumps or the notches, however you want to do it, on the belt, and make note of that so that we have the same coming in. I usually make a mark on the belt also with a permanent marker so that I know where everything's supposed to be. Again, take photographs. You never know if you're going to get interrupted and not be able to come back to it right away. And you want to make sure that you do everything right, preferably the first time. I don't mind working on something once. It makes me grumpy when I have to do it a second time. So anyway, we're going to fix this with some zip ties, make our marks, do our counting, and then we'll remove the belt. Stay with us. Okay, once our tool is secured in place, we placed our other tool back onto the crank because we need to loosen this bolt and remove this retainer. We don't want the crankshaft to move at all. Now there's places on the camshaft here where we can put a crescent wrench, and you can take two crescent wrenches and cross them and hold them together with a C-clamp. It's another way to hold those camshafts in place. You know, there's always more than one way to skin a cat. This is just a very reliable and simple way to do it. Even if we're going to remove these cam gears to change the seals, this holds everything in the exact place that you want it. So I'm going to remove that bolt, and then we're going to remove or loosen the bolt on the tensioner right here. Tensioner is the one on the intake side on my left as I'm facing the firewall, the engine. And then we're going to pull this against the spring and loosen this bolt and pull this idler or tensioner all the way to the left here so that it's loose, so that we can then slip the timing belt off. Okay, like I said, loosen the bolt up. I'm going to slide this over, and then I'm going to retighten this so that it doesn't move. Back on it. Get the ratchet to turn the right direction. Okay, try this again. Loosen it up. Move this over. And just snug it into place there. That's holding that tensioner pulley out of the way, which allows this to be loose now, which allows us to then just remove the belt off the pulleys. We remove the crankshaft bolt, which allows us to remove the retainer. Okay, like I said, now we can slide the belt off. We've got everything marked, recorded, photographed, whatever need be. We're now able to pull the belt off. This was a vehicle that was purchased used. We don't know what the mileage was when this belt was installed. It looks good. Didn't seem to have excess slack from what I've seen in the past, so we weren't in any danger of belt breaking, but now we'll have the benchmark as to how many miles the belt has on it when we start fresh now with a new belt. So next what we're going to do is we're going to remove the idler and the tensioner. And the idler sounds a little dry and noisy. So it's a good thing we're replacing that. So let's move forward. Okay, once we've removed the idler and tension pulleys from the water pump, we then remove two bolts from the water pump inlet here. And we'll show you the water pump so you know what I'm talking about. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but you can see how I broke this loose from that flange. So let me show you the water pump. Alright, so here's what the water pump looks like. I was mentioning the flange where that elbow bolts to. So this is that surface I was talking about. It's two bolts, the same as those that hold the water pump in place. They're all the same size and length. So anyway, that's what we're doing there. Once you remove the 4 bolts from the water pump, just basically tilt the bottom out and it'll come right out. So now we want to prepare to put the new water pump in place, and so we want to clean this surface, the mating surface where the water pump will go. We want that clean and dry, as well as the flange. Make sure there's no gasket material or anything stuck on that. That's a clean surface. And then the installation of the pump will be the reverse of removal, and that will put the upper corner up in there first and then drop it in that way. Make sure you put the gasket on correctly and that it's held in place. I usually put a bolt partway through to hold the washer in place, or the gasket in place. But anyway, that's the real concern there, that you have a clean surface and that the gasket is properly seated. So we'll do that next. Now, one of the things I'm a little detailed about, and that is torquing things to spec. So I always use a torque wrench. There are areas where you can't get a torque wrench into, and you may not own a torque wrench, and it's not absolutely necessary, but the key is don't over torque going into aluminum. The water pump is 18 foot-pounds maximum. And I do it in a cross pattern, and you just want to make sure that everything is snug but not over tightened. So after the water pump has been installed and torqued, we'll then install the idler. The idler pulley goes on right here, and it gets torqued to 35 foot-pounds. I'll just snug it up with the ratchet for right now. And then we're going to install the tensioner on the other side, and they both get torqued to 35 foot-pounds, and I'll torque them at the same time. But in doing that, when it comes to the tensioner, we want to put on a new spring. The spring goes on in this fashion right here, and it will attach, as I'll show you in a moment, as soon as we install the idler, or the tensioner I mean. So let's install the tensioner and then we'll show you how the spring attaches. With the tensioner, there's a little pin that sticks out on the water pump, and that pin, my laser pointer's giving me issues here. Anyway, that pin right here, this part of the tensioner goes over that pin, and then the spring will attach here and to another pin on the water pump. So we'll put this in place. Install it over the pin. And you'll leave this slightly loose so that it's over here where we can put the spring on easily. And should install a new spring that comes with it. So the new spring will go between the pin over here by the idler and come over here to the tensioner, like so. And so notice the orientation. There's an open side to the rubber cover on this, and there's kind of a closed side. The closed side with the hook up like this goes to the right over by the tensioner, or the idler pin, and then this part hooks onto the tensioner. So there we have that installed. Next we'll torque them to 35, 37 foot-pounds. Okay, let me make something a little clearer. We torqued the idler to 35 foot-pounds. On the tensioner, we've pulled it all the way to the left and then snugged it down so it stays in place. We're not torquing it yet because we're going to be loosening that to tension the belt. We just need it to be held in place. So next, this is the little more critical point, and that is we're going to install the belt. And we must install the belt in the proper fashion, and it has to be exactly the way the one that was removed was. So that's why we counted the little cogs and so forth, and marked everything so that the new belt goes on exactly as the old belt came off. So this is going to be hard to show you without stepping in front of the light or the camera or both. But we're going to drop the belt down in here. We're going to run it onto the one sprocket here and across to the next. Holding it snug like this so it stays in place. Bring it down around the crank, and this is where it gets tricky. You got to be able to have good light, see what you're doing. We want good tension on this side, but we can't move the crank when everything's said and done. You know, the crank still has to line up to that top dead center mark that we looked at previously. And so I'm going to have to step in front of the camera to reach down in there and do that, but that's what we're doing. And then what we'll do is we'll double check our count here, make sure we're the same as before, and then be able to set the tension on the belt. So I'll install the belt and be right back. Okay, once we have the belt on, then we can install our crankshaft flange here, or boss. Put that back in with the nut, and then we're going to remove our tool here, and then we will rotate the crankshaft clockwise 1 5/6 revolutions, and we'll show you where we're going to stop. So let me install this onto the crankshaft. And once we've done that, we'll be ready to rotate this once we remove our tool. Now I've marked on the camshaft gears here a mark where these line up in case I have to reference it again. That's where they line up with my tool. So remove the tool. And now we're ready to rotate the crankshaft. So let me get in here, show you a close-up of what we're doing. So here's the crankshaft. I'll get the camera down in here. I'll put my ratchet on there. And we're going to turn it clockwise. So we're going to watch it. When the pen comes back around, that'll be 1 revolution. See the pen? And then you can see our notch. That's 1 revolution. Now we're going to go a tad bit more here. And what we're going to do is we're going to line up with this right here. Let me grab my pen to show you. We're going to line up the notch with this little piece right here on the oil pump housing. So not top dead center, but right over here. This is our tensioning mark. That's where we're going to line up the notch on the crank with that right there. Okay? So we'll continue to bring that around. Go slow and easy here. And boy, there we have it. I went past it a little bit. But I can tell we're off. So we're going to bring it back up to top dead center and go around again. But I can tell by the tension maybe here. Well, we'll go around and try it again. So now we got to go around and 2 times to bring it back up to top dead center, which is where we are right now. But we want to go around another 1 5/6 revolutions, just shy of two complete revolutions, and line it up with that mark again. I'm trying to film and do it at the same time. I went past it, so I'm going to do it without the camera in my hand, but we showed you what we're talking about, so we'll do that and then we'll show you how to tension. So once we have that lined up with the tensioning mark, we're going to release the tensioner bolt here a little bit to allow it to move with the spring. So the spring's going to tension it. Then I'm going to tighten this back up. We don't want that idler or this tensioner pulley to move when we retorque this thing. Keep an eye on it, make sure it stays in place. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to go 2 1/16 revolutions. In other words, we're going to bring this back up to where it's top dead center from that tensioning mark, and then go 2 full revolutions, and make sure that all of our marks line up on the crank as well as on our camshaft gears. Make sure everything lines up, and if it doesn't, then you have a problem. So let's check it out and see how it turned out. So I did my 2 1/16 revolutions. I put my little tool back in, but you can use the marks from the factory to confirm that we can see everything lines up and that the crank is at top dead center. So at this point we know that the belt is installed correctly. That's very important. So the next thing that we want to make sure is correct is the tension on the belt. Very important adjustment. And sometimes it takes more than once to get it right. But this is the first thing that we want to confirm, and that is that the belt is on correctly and that our timing is correct, that our camshafts and our crank are in the correct relationship to one another. So now, let's check the belt tension. So next we want to measure the timing belt tension. I'm going to do that with a straight edge. Use my tool here again. And then you put 20 pounds of pressure, and you're going to measure that deviation. And it should be between 0.35 and 0.45 inches. So just under 3/8 of an inch and just under 1/2 of an inch. And like I said, sometimes it takes more than once to do it. This one's a little bit loose. So what we're going to do is we'll loosen the tensioner, go back around 1 5/6 revolutions, loosen it again, snug back down the tensioner, go around 2 1/6 revolutions, and check it again. Remember to get your marks on the tensioning mark down there. So the key to remember is it's 1 5/6, or go around one time, and the second time stop at that mark on the oil pump there, your tensioning mark. Loosen the tensioner, bolt, let it spring, bring it snug, snug it back up, and go 2 1/6 times around and check it again. And then once you have the tension correct, double check again while you're there, top dead center, that your timing is the way it should be. And that would be the belt installed at that point. Next we're going to replace the timing belt cover. Remember, it's 3 pieces, and we're going to do it starting at the bottom one, the middle, and the top, the upper one. And remember that the 3 bolts on the lower one are shorter than the rest. Well, actually, it's not the 3 bolts on the lower one. 2 bolts on the lower one, and then this bolt on the middle one are shorter than the rest of them. So you have 3 short bolts, and I think 4 or 5 longer ones. So here's the timing belt cover torque sequence, and you can see the pencil marks there. Those are the short bolts, 1, 2, and 4, or I'm sorry, 3, 2, and 4, or 4, 3, 2. Anyway, those are the shorter ones, and you want to torque those in sequence to it's about 95 inch-pounds, and so there you have it. Leave the camera on long enough so that you can take note. Well, next we're going to put the pulley boss back in place, and with the bolt. And again, we need to secure that. We showed you the tool we used previously, but we need to secure that because we're going to torque this bolt to 130 foot-pounds. So that's a pretty good torque, and we need to hold the crank still while we do that. So we'll do that, and we'll tell you what's next. Well, after torquing on the crankshaft bolt, next we're going to put on this plate. Remember to put it the correct direction out. I marked this one, So that's out that way. Then after that, we'll put our crankshaft pulley back on, and we will torque those 4 bolts down. And the torque on those is about 13 foot-pounds for the crankshaft pulley bolts. Then after that, we will put the water pump pulley back on, and that gets torqued on to that looks like 95 inch-pounds also. So there you have it. We'll do that and we'll be back. Well, once we have the pulleys installed and torqued, then we're going to do the valve cover. Make sure you clean all the mating surfaces, both on the head and on the valve cover. Replace the gasket if need be. And this is the torque sequence. This is again to 95 inch-pounds. But that is the sequence. Hope that shows up well. So there you have it. Almost forgot to mention that before we put the valve cover in place, we need to put some sealant in a few locations, 6 locations, on either side of the bearing caps. So that's 2, 4, and then on the back here, 5, 6. Just a little dab will do you to seal that intersection right there. Next, we're going to reattach the coil pack to the back side of the valve cover with those 2 bolts. And then we're going to install the spark plugs and torque them to 16 foot-pounds. And then we will reinstall the plug wires. Make sure you noted where they went. And if you've forgotten, let me show you a little diagram to help. Okay, you see the 2 diagrams there? The upper one is for 90 and 91. The lower one is for 92 and later. So you see the plug order is the same, but what changes is the pack numbering on the coil pack. So make sure you have you know, the number 1 spark plug goes to the number 1 coil position, so forth. After reinstalling the plug wires, hook the vacuum hose back up to the crankcase vent, and now we're going to put the power steering pump back in place. We're not going to tighten anything down yet because we have to put the belts back on, but got to put the pump back in place first, put that long through bolt in place. So we'll do that next. Next, we're going to replace the drive belts, the one that runs the from the crank around the water pump pulley to the alternator, and the other one goes from the crank to the power steering and to the air conditioning. Here's the look at the old belt that came off. It's showing some cracks. The other one's not quite as bad as this one, but we're replacing both of them with new belts. So we want to make sure that we get the belts on correctly, that they fit in the grooves on the pulleys correctly and are centered, and then we will adjust them using the adjustment right here. They're both the same. We'll put them on there, and we want them to be tight but not too tight. So you're going to want to have a little bit of deflection. if they're not tight enough, I always like to make them a little bit on the looser side. If they're too tight, you put extra stress on the bearings. For instance, on the water pump, which we don't want to have to replace again anytime soon. But if they're loose, when you turn on the air conditioning or you turn on the lights and so forth, the belt will squeal. You don't want that. So we want it tight enough that the belts don't slip, but yet aren't putting undue stress on the bearings of the accessory. So we're going to do that now. Well, after our belts are installed and adjusted, next we're going to reinstall our water lines, our upper radiator hose, and the two lines that go to the thermostat housing. Then we'll install the fan again, and then reinstall the intake tube. Well, now that we have everything installed, we're going to roll it back off the ramps. We're going to flush the radiator. Good idea, every time you replace the water pump, make sure any foreign debris that's in there from either the installation or removal of the water pumps, anyway, and put fresh coolant in. So that's what we're going to do now. We'll roll this out, flush the radiator, and then we'll refill the radiator, and then we're going to reconnect our battery and start it up. And if you've done everything correctly, it should sound pretty good. So let's see how it turned out. All right, here we are at the moment of truth. Let's see if she starts up. Sounds pretty good. Turn on the accessories, make sure our belts are tight. Sounds good. So one of the things you want to do after the job is keep an eye on your fluid levels, especially the coolant. Make sure you got all the air out of the system and that the radiator is full. Don't be checking it in just the overflow. Check it at the radiator, and only check it when it's cold. Don't pull off the radiator cap once it's warmed up. So we hope you find this video helpful. If you have any questions, please see the email link on the beginning of the video and address all your questions and comments to that. We don't respond to comments left on YouTube. Thanks again for watching.